Hi, everybody. It's Maynard, Colin, Matt, and Mike, and we've got a really exciting show for you here just a few days before Christmas. I think everybody noticed the stimulus bill finally got through both houses of Congress, and we couldn't think of anybody better to talk to than the folks at No Labels. If you don't know No Labels, we're going to give you a better description, but it's an organization fundamentally committed to getting Democrats and Republicans and people of all, whatever party you might be, to work together better. And they've had a lot of success. So first of all, let me welcome Ryan Clancy. He's the chief strategist with No Labels. Ryan, it's great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Maynard. Appreciate it.
Well, you're probably exhausted. There's been a lot going on up there, but we can't wait to hear the story. While you get ready, Ryan, Mike, what would you tell our world about what's happening on the screen and what's happening these last 10 days of December?
Yeah, thanks, Maynard. What I'd say is it's going to be choppy. Volumes are down substantially here over the last couple days, and they're going to be down substantially over the next week or two. People are just closing their books on the year. They've had a great year in general. And I think, guys, in the energy sector, there's a general, avoidance of risk at this point in time. If you look at what's happened here over in the XLE just recently, the volumes have gone up and the XOP volumes have gone down substantially. It looks to us like guys are just saying, you know what, I need exposure. I'm taking some beta out. I'm staying these more liquid names and see how 2020 starts out. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we had a merger this week. Diamondback bought some assets. That was a bit surprising for some, just from a timing standpoint. And we're not going to really comment on the deal, but I think the point is we're going to see these type of deals in the future, and we're going to see a lot of these deals going on in the future. And it's because I think clients and I think investors, it's not that they want them, they're insisting on this happen, and consolidation has to happen. Thirdly, I'd say, crude oil has had a really good run over the last, say 2 to 3 months. The energy equities had a good run, and the equities are now starting to fall off a bit, and crude oil is starting to hit some resistance. And the reason why is that, from a demand standpoint, you and I know what's happening on the COVID. You have lockdowns in Europe, so demand's being called into question, at least over the next couple of weeks. But from a supply standpoint, we're now hearing about Russia talking about maybe potentially wanting to raise in February another 500,000 barrels a day. We're getting a lot of more news stories on the JCPOA with Biden opening that. That's potentially putting more supply sooner than people think. And, it's just, that's the issue that's going on right now. And so, right now, the biggest fear for me in the markets right now is Asia is really holding this whole thing together, Asian demand. If that starts to wane a little bit, we're starting to see some weakness in Brent time spread, something that we've pointed to a lot. Then we're going to have some consolidation happening. So, look, the group has come a long way. There's going to be some profit taking. That's not a bad thing. I still think the fundamentals look good into 2021. But I think investors right now, from a sentiment standpoint, are saying, you know what, we've had 3 good months. Let's step to the sidelines and see how things play out. So volumes are going to be terrible over the next couple of weeks. And don't let that influence you on how 2021 is going to set up.
Well, I was afraid there I was going to have to put a little something in your eggnog to perk you up. You were kind of on a handful of rough things. But I mean, it does seem logical that people have experienced a nice 3-month run or so. And so taking some money off the table seems like a pretty wise thing to do. Who knows?
Yeah. And I think, I don't think there's just a 6 or 9 or 12 month people are just saying, you know what, the whole secular case for energy is over. There never was a secular case for energy. This is a cyclical move in energy. We think there's still more of a cyclical move into 2021. And with that move, we still see 25 to 30, 35% upside in a lot of names. So we're still bullish, but recognizing that the next 2, 3, 4 weeks could be a little choppy. And so be prepared for it.
All right, Matt, what do you got? What's on your mind?
Yeah, Maynard, the research team's actually tracking a lot of really interesting data right now, and we're starting to see actually a fairly constructive setup for natural gas. So just as a reminder, a couple of weeks ago, we took down our 2021 natural gas price forecast to $2.70 an MCF. That was really predicated on 2 things. One, we were seeing slightly higher volumes show up into year-end flow data. And 2, the start to winter in the U.S. was fairly disappointing. However, what we do find quite interesting and why we are starting to get more constructive and we could see some upside to our current forecast is really driven by a couple of different factors. First of all, Asia is seeing extremely strong demand. China in particular is having a nice blast of cold weather coming through, and that has sent Asian LNG prices up quite a bit. So right now, if you look at the JKM market, we're trading about $10 plus an MCF. That's actually influencing the European market. And outside the US, Europe is really the only major market that has significant storage. And so what's happening right now is LNG cargoes that were going to show up in Europe in our model in Q4 and Q1 are basically being diverted due to strong demand and about a 5% decrease in global supply due to a bunch of disruptions occurring in regions like Qatar, Australia, Nigeria, et cetera. So the setup here is basically that European storage levels are drawing faster than we expected. And ultimately what that is going to do is potentially put upward pressure on European demand for natural gas during the summer. So we were previously expecting capacity to get curtailed because we felt like storage levels in Europe were going to be quite high. With this strong Asian demand pull and effectively lower inventories in Europe, we think that ultimately is going to set up for a pretty constructive backdrop for natural gas in Q2 and Q3. We could see another 2 to 3 BCF a day of LNG shipments out of the US versus our current model. And effectively, the punchline on that is we could see another 25 to 30 cent upside to our current strip price forecast of 270. So all in, while I think clients are quite concerned around the winter environment in the US and things were looking fairly bearish a couple weeks ago, with this change in the global balances on LNG, I think it's something that people should be paying attention to and looking at to potentially play on the long side, both from a commodity perspective as well as an equity perspective.
Colin, any pregame from you before Ryan tells us what's going on in Washington, D.C.?
Well, maybe just a little bit of a lead in. I haven't really seen very many news articles talk about the energy components in the consolidated appropriations bill for 2021. Now, obviously, the Department of Energy has to be funded, but if you look through Division D in particular, there's some very nice appropriations for research, basic research in science and technology, including modular reactors in nuclear, carbon capture, and of course, transportation. So I would just advise taking a look at that and keeping an eye on some funding of that research.
Now, I forwarded the link prior to today's session. Did everybody dutifully read that? Colin, do you have a page count on that appropriations bill?
5,593. I believe the term coronavirus appears 211 times.
Oh, come on. Did you do a search, really?
Of course I did.
Fantastic. Mike, did you maybe into the 3,000s, something like that?
12 pages in, fell asleep.
Oh, 12 pages. Okay. Well, look, it's okay. You don't have to read it. Ryan is here. Again, he's from No Labels. And Ryan, we're so happy to have you. Maybe one place to start is some of us know about No Labels and the work you guys are doing, but not everybody does. Would you mind kicking us off, telling us about the organization, what you do there? And again, thanks for joining us in a holiday week.
Sure.
We got so excited when the stimulus bill or the appropriations bill passed that we just had to talk to you. So thank you for joining us on short notice.
Sure. Thank you for having me. And to be clear, I didn't get much further than Mike did on that 5,600 page bill. So I read some pieces, but I haven't read it all. But no, as you noted at the top, Maynard, No Labels this past week was actually our 10th anniversary. So we've been at this for a really long time. The mission's never changed, which is to build a bipartisan governing coalition capable of solving the country's toughest problems. Though the mission hasn't changed, the goal has suddenly started to seem a lot closer than it ever had, which I know for a lot of people might be surprising given the madness that has kind of enveloped our politics here for the better part of really a decade. It's very hard, I think, for people to understand politics, for better or worse, through a lens that doesn't involve President Trump. But we always remind people, this partisanship and dysfunction was such a huge problem before the president got in there. It's going to continue to be a problem when he's gone if there isn't a group like ours, which is trying to find some kind of common ground between the parties. And the biggest project we've had in Congress is we helped forge the creation of this thing called the House Problem Solvers Caucus, which has 50 members, evenly divided between the parties. And increasingly, we've started to make inroads into the Senate, and now we have a group of about 8 to 10 senators, bipartisan, who are working regularly with not just one another, but with the House group. So what's exciting for us is that this bill that passed this week, over the course of the 10 years, and Maynard, you and I were talking offline a little earlier about this, but I think it's fair to say, to use a baseball analogy, that no labels and our allies have hit, plenty of singles and doubles. There are consequential bipartisan things that our group has been lead movers on. In particular, the USMCA trade deal. They played a really active role in getting that over the finish line. But people were still waiting for, where is the headline story that says, here's this huge consequential thing that got done, and it only got done because of the work of this group. And that's this COVID deal. In fact, the New York Times has a huge write-up today about how this deal came together. And the sort of stars of the story are Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Susan Collins from Maine, who are our closest Senate allies, and Tom Reed, the Republican from upstate New York, who's the co-chair, along with Josh Gottheimer, of the House Problem Solvers Caucus. And to give folks a sense of why we're so hopeful about what this means, it isn't just that this COVID-19 bill was desperately needed. And so on its merits, it's a really big deal. But we really think what happened here is a model for how things could actually work in 2021. Because if you look back over the course of these last 6 months, I mean, you've had people saying since June, we need another COVID relief bill. It was obvious. Economists say it, members of Congress say it, their constituents say it. And yet for months and months and months, you had Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell just sniping at each other and basically making no meaningful attempt to actually work on a bill that could get over the finish line. For the whole summer, you had Speaker Pelosi pushing a $3 trillion bill the Senate Republicans would never support. You had Mitch McConnell pushing a $500 billion, quote, skinny bill he knew the House Democrats would never support. And it just kind of went on that way indefinitely, including until after the election. And I mean, this is for weeks after the election, we have on good intelligence, Speaker Pelosi and Mitch McConnell did not even talk, despite the fact that you knew this deal needed to come together. What changed was our group forcing the issue. When our group came out 2 weeks ago with their $908 billion compromise proposal, it suddenly started to make the position of McConnell and Pelosi look untenable, because their basic posture was, well, it's the other side that's being unreasonable. And if they would only be reasonable, I could work with them. And then what happened is basically their bluff got called, because you had 10 senators, 50 House members, in effect saying, hey, we got to yes, why can't you? And that was really the beginning of breaking the logjam and getting these folks back to the table. And like I said, we hope that this is a model going into next year, whether you're talking about immigration or infrastructure or anything else.
It's really fantastic. And think this discussion should start with thank you. Thank you for doing this kind of work, because it doesn't matter what your sentiment is. I haven't found anyone that says, gosh, I wish people fought more in Washington. So that's the one thing we're all agreed on. Do you mind telling us about your own personal history and what drew you to the organization, and
sure, and
who else is working in No Labels, and the people that make up the effort?
So No Labels, as I said, it got its start a decade ago with people from both sides of the aisles who had ran campaigns, former elected officials, people who'd done fundraising, who just sort of sensed that something was fundamentally broken with our politics. Me personally, I've been with No Labels for about 8 years, and I actually came up through communications and writing. So I actually used to be a speechwriter for Biden when he was vice president, among others. And, I think that one of the things when people think about No Labels, they will often sort of throw us into a bucket and they say, oh, well, that's the moderates or the centrist types. And There are certainly some moderates and centrists in our coalition, but there's a lot of conservatives and liberals too. And that's a really important distinction, because I think a lot of time people think when they hear moderate, it's like, that's sort of, you don't really have any principles, or, you're just for the sort of lowest denominator compromise between the parties. That's not what it is at all. We have people who are unapologetic about being conservative and liberal, and yet they acknowledge that I'm never going to wake up and be king or queen for a day. I'm never going to get the opportunity to just get every single thing I want. And so you hear a lot of the Republicans in our caucus, they love to cite a phrase that Ronald Reagan used to use, which frankly, quite a few Republicans today probably could use a refresher on this, which is, he said, my 80% friend is not my 20% enemy, right? If we're together on most things, let's work on those things. And we can disagree on these other things, and maybe we'll never agree on them, or maybe, we'll have to, we will agree on them at some point. But let's focus on the things now that we can get to yes on.
It is, that distinction is, I'm really glad you made that, because you do jump to the conclusion moderate people feel less passionately and are most likely to be a part of the organization. And so the fact that you have people at more polar ends of it is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I say it is less about ideology and it's more about attitude. So you really can be. And if you look at the members, go to the Problem Solvers Caucus. They have our own website, and you will look at lots of members. You will recognize as, wow, those guys strike me as pretty conservative. John Cornyn has been in quite a few of our meetings. Right, he's a pretty conservative guy, but he has been one of the things No Labels does pretty regularly is we host these things called bicameral meetings, where we actually have rank and file House and Senate members speaking with one another, and it isn't about ideology. It's about attitude. It's do I recognize on some level that I have to be pragmatic and that I can really fight like heck for the things I believe in, but there often comes a point where we need to pass a budget to keep the lights on. We got to get a COVID deal done because the country needs it. And even though it doesn't have everything I want, and even though I prefer it had this or that, or it didn't have this or that, this is a whole lot better than nothing. And that's the kind of people that you're going to find in our orbit.
So how do you guys, and then please everybody else jump in here, how do you guys recruit or existing Congress people or senators? Like what are your selling points? And
sure.
And do you even go so far as to encourage certain candidates to run because they seem like once they get there, they'll be, drawn to this way of thinking?
So it's a great question. And the short answer is we, No Labels, don't do the recruiting. The members themselves do. So No Labels, we really did in so many different ways give birth to this Problem Solvers Caucus. But what happened is it happened over the course of years. And initially it was us just pulling these members into meetings and getting them to build trust and relationships with one another. The moment that the light bulb went on for me as to how dysfunctional the place was I was sitting in the office of a Republican member of Congress in the Capitol. He points across the hall, and there was a Democrat who'd been there for about the same amount of time, 5 or 6 years. He goes, "See that guy? I've never talked to him before." He said, I've said hi to him in the hallway. But that's when it clicked for me, is that how do you think you're going to take people who don't know, like, or trust each other at all and throw them in a room and say, all right, now go fix immigration, go fix Social Security? It'll never happen because there's no trust. And so initially, that's really what No Labels was doing. We were building trust among these members. And then something really special happened, which is the members themselves decided, hey, we think we've got something here, and we are actually going to organize into a formal caucus. So just how, you have the Freedom Caucus, that's like the Tea Party guys. You have the Progressive Caucus, that's like the more left-wing folks in the squad. The thing they figured out is that if you organize into a block and you sort of vote together, you really have a lot more influence. And so that's what the Problem Solvers do. And so their co-chairs, Josh Gottheimer and Tom Reed, They have 50 members. If somebody wants to join the caucus, they have to interview with Reed and Gottheimer. They actually have something called the Noah's Ark rule. So if you want to come out as a Democrat, you need to bring a Republican and vice versa.
That's funny.
And they have really strict rules, standards of behavior. Like you can't come into this group and just sort of give lip service to, I like bipartisanship, and then not walk the walk. So you can't, for example, campaign against anybody else in the caucus. Or if 75% of the caucus gets to yes on an issue, all the members have to get behind it, even if they wouldn't otherwise do that on their own. And so to come back to your original question, it's no labels. We are not the boss of these members. They set their own agenda. They pick their own members. What we do is we've created this support network around them of citizens, of supporters across the country who really provide a lot of grassroots and political support for them.
So Ryan, what's your forecast on the momentum? Are more folks getting on the arc, or are we kind of stuck at the pairs that we have right now?
Absolutely. The interest has been unbelievable in the wake of the election. And I think there's a couple things driving that. The first is, if you go back to these dynamics I was talking about with the COVID relief bill going nowhere for months, I can't express to you, I can't overstate the level of frustration that these members have about the way Congress has been working. And this is true on both sides. It's that, when we all sort of came up and in civics class, you kind of learned about how a bill was supposed to become law, and there's relevant committees and bills move through those committees and members can put forth amendments. None of that happens anymore. It's entirely leadership driven. Last year, Bill Cassidy, who's one of our great allies in the Senate from Louisiana, he talked about his frustration, and he wrote in the Wall Street Journal about this, that at the end of the year, the year-long spending bill, which was 2,400 pages and allocated $1.4 trillion, he had 2.5 days to read it. No chance to offer any amendments. So members for a long time had really been chafing at the way, in Washington, they call it regular order, in the way in which that had broken down. So they had started to gravitate to our group as almost like a workaround, that like, hey, if we're just going to have gridlock or leadership having this expectation, we're just going to rubber stamp whatever they can cook up, we're going to create our alternative policymaking process. And so over time, you started to see so much more interest. And then in the wake of the election, I think for a lot of these members, it was just a sense of pragmatism that they looked towards 2021 and they said, look at this. You got Democrats with maybe a 5-6 seat majority in the House. You have, depending on what happens in Georgia on January 5th, the Republicans will either have, best case, 52 seats, or for Democrats, best case is it's 50-50 and Kamala Harris is breaking the tiebreaker. In either scenario, you have such a small delta between the parties, and that really creates, for a group like ours, you can create what is in effect a swing block. And I think that's really an incentive for members, is that if they want to be in the mix, if they want their voice and their vote to count, they know being a part of this group is a great way to do it.
Do you think, Ryan, there's anything for you guys to do in the executive branch? Because I think all of us watch the various government agencies and departments and such, and it's clear that those places are populated by some Democratic appointed people, some Republican appointed people, and they frequently don't look like they're working together. Mm-hmm. And do you think there's more to be done there?
I'll tell you what, we haven't focused so much on the executive branch. And of course, the executive branch is really made up of two different layers. You kind of have the career bureaucracy that is there permanently between administrations. And then you have the 4,000 or 5,000 political appointees that layer on top, depending on which administration is in. But here's what I would say. Our focus really is on Congress, but that actually does have a direct impact on the executive branch. One of the things we've really been noting as we look at the intense frustration that people have for so many different reasons with our politics, and why is that One of the things that's happening is because Congress has over time completely abdicated its responsibility to do so many things. And when Congress abdicates its responsibility, what ends up happening is decisions end up getting made by these executive branch agencies, which are actually not very accountable to the public, and by the courts. And that's another one of the reasons why every one of these judicial fights, especially over the Supreme Court, is it becomes, every single one becomes worse than the last one and more heated. And it seems like every single Supreme Court nomination is this zero-sum battle for every single thing the parties believe in. And again, part of the reason for that is because Congress is not doing its job. I mean, I'll just give you a perfect example. Immigration. 2016, President Obama, by executive order, protects the Dreamers and says, the Dreamers can stay here. President Trump comes in, tries to reverse that order, and then he does an executive order of his own to try to build a border wall. Now, let's step back for a minute. Whether or not you agree that the Dreamers should be protected, and most Americans do, whether or not you agree that we should actually have some kind of physical barrier or a more robust barrier on the southern border. It is not the president's job. It is not their constitutional right to make either of those decisions. Congress is the one that is supposed to decide whether or not Dreamers stay. Congress is the one that is supposed to appropriate money for a border wall. But because they don't do it, the presidents have just been sucking in more and more power. So to get back to your original question, if Congress would actually reassert itself more, I think you'd have less frustration with some of these agencies because they'd have less power.
Why do you think just basic stuff doesn't happen? Like you're the president, whoever you are, just 3 or 4 nights a week, you just have dinner with someone from Congress. Hi, how are you? Tell me about your family. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? It's no nice to meet you. If I need you, I might call you someday, or you call me. Like, why does now, maybe you're going to tell me that happens, but it just seems like the most basic stuff doesn't happen. Kind of like your example, unfortunately.
Well, that kind of goes back to this fundamental idea we had about relationships and trust. And it's interesting when people start thinking about, well, what's wrong with our democracy? And, there's so many different structural explanations, and you've heard them all. And it's, well, we need to get money out of politics, or we have to fix gerrymandering, or we need to, get rid of the electoral college. Like, pick your, right? And some of those have varying degrees of merit. But what people miss is that, like, these members of Congress and people in administration, they're not just like interchangeable widgets. They are people. And the lack of personal relationships is such a driver of the dysfunction, because to your point, Maynard, if I know you, if I know your spouse, if I know your kids, if you and I have shared a meal together, it's a little harder for me to go on Fox News or MSNBC every night and just demonize you and like turn you into this cartoon villain. And, the members themselves, we hear them talk about this. It did used to be they typically would live in DC year round. Their families would come there. What happens now is a lot of them never even move their families. They're there like 3 days a week. They kind of fly home on a Thursday night. They fly back in on a Monday night or a Tuesday morning. So you don't see those relationships. And one of the ways in which that has started to change for the better is through our group, is that you really do see friendships, like real friendships, not the kind of fake friendships where, like, when you hear somebody say on the floor of Congress and they say, as my distinguished colleague says, like that's a euphemism for as that jerk over there said, right? Like these are real friendships. They really have an affection for one another, and you can tell.
Yeah, Ryan, now that there's been the success of this appropriations package mediated by Manchin and Collins and the others, one of the other big bills that's been sitting out there for years has been the idea of an infrastructure bill. And at times you've seen both sides kind of embrace it and then walk it back. Where do we stand on an infrastructure bill from your perspective? And did this week's success change the odds of that at all?
I mean, there is definitely an appetite for that among our group. In fact, our group released their own broad bipartisan infrastructure proposal about a year ago. But it isn't easy. Like one of the running jokes in Washington for the last year is that it's always infrastructure week. Like that's always going to be the week the infrastructure push is supposed to start, and then it never does. I think the challenge, as like lots of things are in DC, is there is such broad agreement that we need it. Where it breaks down is how to pay for it. And I think that this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but I think on balance, you tend to see Democrats pushing for new federal funding that is maybe financed by either some kind of user fees, a fuel tax, a freight tax, something like that, or changes to corporate taxation. Like that's one of the proposals we've seen. On the Republican side, you see proposals that are more oriented around public-private partnerships, or you're using tax credits to incent, a multiple of private investment. President-elect Biden will definitely put forth an infrastructure proposal. I'm pretty sure of it, and I think he's going to find some willing partners in the Problem Solvers group and their Senate allies. I will say that if I'm being a realist about it, though, when we get to the end of this year, we're going to have racked up a deficit close to $4 trillion. And I mean, look, if you're asking me personally, given how low interest rates are and given the need for this infrastructure, do I think you could justify another big package? Absolutely. But I do think it is politically going to start to get harder as we get on the other side of this crisis. And it doesn't feel like, it starts to feel like we're getting out of this pandemic, God willing. There is going to be some voices for fiscal discipline reasserting themselves, and infrastructure does have a big price tag. So it'll be tough. They'll have to be, I think, though, the thing that would give me hope is they're going to have to be creative in terms of how they get at it. Just like they did with this COVID package. And neither side's going to get everything that they want.
Ryan, just to follow into that question, it's been brought up multiple times from various different participants on this show. Is there a desire in Washington to see fiscal discipline from a bipartisan perspective, or is this really kind of moving back to the roots of the Republican Party, or kind of a little bit more discipline from the Democrats? Just curious kind of how it's looked at from a bipartisan perspective.
I will say that one of the things that we've had in our House and Senate, so I mentioned we have these bicameral meetings where we have House and Senate members and they're coming together to talk about issues. One of the things they've already started doing as they look towards next year is to pair off into working groups. So to try to, again, do the same kind of thing here that, hey, let's not sit around and wait for leadership's answers. Let's come up with some of our own. So there are working groups on small business. There's one on immigration. There's one on infrastructure. There is one on debt and deficits. And there is a desire to get back to that discussion. I think the challenge with it is that, for as long as we've been talking about how problematic deficits are, there really hasn't been a moment where anyone in Washington has had to face up to the consequences of it, right? Interest rates are still low. It's easy to finance this stuff. I mean, my concern sometimes is that, they won't get serious about it until like there's a treasury auction and then nobody shows up, like that. You hope it doesn't get to that, but there is definitely an appetite to have a really robust discussion here, because this, like, what we're doing is not sustainable. Everything we've done this year is justifiable, and you completely understand this is not right now, mid-pandemic, is not the time to be talking about austerity and fiscal discipline. But we're going to have that conversation probably earlier than people expect. And I do expect this group will be in the middle of it because they recognize that it is a looming threat.
So, Ryan, one thing that I think a couple of people who visited with us have said it, and we certainly feel it, but, energy feels like a very polarized topic in Washington. People feel differently about all sorts of things. Do you think what would you tell us about the energy debate? Any chances that that's an issue that people could, kind of move a little closer to the middle on? Anything you notice from your group? And we're volunteering to come to Washington, D.C. and present to your entire group. And we promise we'll be right down the middle. If you'll hear us.
I have to say that one is such a tough one. And because I think to an extent that maybe it wasn't the case 10 years ago, but, there are some issues in our politics that are increasingly driven by emotion and not by facts. And I think that's kind of what we're starting to see with the energy and climate debate. And I think, before this election, I along with our co-executive director, Margaret White, we actually did a book called The Ultimate Guide to the 2020 Election. And the whole idea was not to talk about the candidates and not to tell people what they should think in terms of policy outcomes, but really to understand, if you wanted to understand the nature of problems and the outlines of solution, like here's the things you needed to know. And the thing, like when you look at something like the climate and energy debate, is that there really is no middle ground right now. It's that, if you think about like just climate change alone, you kind of have like one side, well, it's a hoax invented by the Chinese. And then the other side says, well, we're going to have this Green New Deal and we're going to have no fossil fuels in 8 years and we're going to weatherize 100 million buildings. And it's like neither of those things are remotely tenable. And so I would that is one issue where I think there needs to be such a reality check. And it's almost like, I feel like not just to the public, but members, it's like they need physics lessons, like in terms of how energy works. And, like that you should be able to have two competing thoughts in your head. You should be able to recognize that climate change is a challenge. It's one we need to address. And yet there is a reason why fossil fuels play such a dominant role in our economy, because of their energy density and their portability. And, one of the things as we were pulling together the facts for this book, you start to look at things like, just take making steel, right? Like you can't make steel without fossil fuels. I mean, there's like a couple, kind of pilot projects in Sweden and they're trying it with hydrogen, but you can't make steel. So it's like the sort of level of unreality that, we're going to just power the whole country on wind and solar in 5-10 years. It's just, that has no basics in physics. So it's a very tough issue. We would love to, if you guys want to come to DC, one of the things we definitely do set up is we provide opportunities for people to come in and talk to members and, talk about issues they care about. And
we will take that in a heartbeat if you'll have us. And, we're from Texas, so we'll bring the barbecue too to go with the presentation.
That's good.
Well, gosh, Ryan, I mean, we just feel like we've hit the gold mine with you. Next week, we're doing a Bitcoin show, so we'll call it the Bitcoin Gold Mine so that we're more modern. But how can the rest of us help you? How can we help the organization? Because it's really great to see some of these green shoots of partnership and cooperation and putting the country first. And that's what everybody wants. So how can we, this is the, help us help you, Tom Cruise moment.
There's a couple of things. First of all, if you like what you hear, nolabels.org, that's the website. If you want to sign up, get on our mailing list. If you want to contribute to our organization, that would be hugely helpful.
Dumb question, Ryan. What would you do with the money? Like, what's your biggest spending?
So no Labels is a C4 organization. So we're an advocacy group. So a contribution to us means that's funding all the effort that we do in the digital realm to organize citizens, right? Like, so that's our Facebook ads and our email program. That's our policy work, like the Ultimate Guidebook I mentioned to you. That is in a post-COVID world. We'll be doing events again. So like last year, we did a huge convention up in New Hampshire where we invited a bunch of the candidates there. And then, of course, it's the operating budget. So you're paying salaries, keeping the lights on. We do also do a ton as we get further into the election. We do a lot of fundraising on behalf of these candidates I mentioned, so our House and Senate allies. And so if that's something people want to learn about over time, we're happy to coach them up on that. And then the second thing would be, if you do like what you're hearing and you want to learn more, there's so much programming that we have. Every week we have something called like an expert briefing. It's 4:00 Eastern, usually on Tuesdays. We've had the former and current heads of the FDA, the former and current Treasury Secretary. This coming week, we got Tom Friedman from the New York Times. We've had people who lead biotech companies, like just really interesting, nonpartisan insights. So that would be number two. That's a great way to get involved. And then the last thing would be, if you like this, like just be an advocate for it. That's really the biggest thing. We do lots of marketing like every other group, but how do most people really get to know No Labels? It's someone they know, like, or trust says, hey, check out this group and give them a shot.
Well, Ryan, we just thank you all the way around. This was great, and it was on short notice, and you're doing holiday errands and took some time out to spend time with us, and you've made our holiday brighter, because there's some good stuff happening in Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everybody. Merry Christmas.